privileges. So that, yeah, I lost my bullhorn privileges, and it does make me sad. But this, that picture of me is actually on the subway coming back from the Women's March. Apparently I took a little snooze on the subway, but who wouldn't? It was a long day. It was very hot in Atlanta that day. So for those of you who are new with us, who might not be familiar 100% with Self-Care for Advocates, we founded Self-Care for Advocates in 2014, and then we formalized that in 2020. Our mission is to prevent and mitigate and treat the negative effects of trauma exposure on helping professionals. We said yesterday that Self-Care for Advocates begins and ends with advocates, and we absolutely mean that. We recognize trauma exposure for being what it is, so either direct trauma or indirect trauma. Kyle, do you want to talk about our unique perspective?
Yeah, so one of the things that you may have noticed in this presentation, or if you've worked with us before, is our approach and our understanding of self-care and these issues really goes beyond how it's traditionally talked about. So we take a biopsychosocial approach to understanding stress and trauma and overall wellness. And we recognize that there's both psychological as well as physiological effects of repeated trauma exposure, whether that's direct or indirect. And then our approach to addressing this is really built into a social ecological model. So anybody that's worked in prevention has seen the social ecological model for violence prevention. We really take that from our own experience of using it in prevention work, and we apply it to the issue of vicarious trauma and, as we said, advocate trauma. And just to expand a little bit about why we say advocate trauma, and we have that inclusion of both direct and indirect, this presentation is specifically going to be talking about survivor advocates and that overlap between direct experience as well as indirect trauma exposure from the work. But we also know that advocates often find themselves in dangerous situations as well. And I believe I even saw on a chat earlier that somebody said that they have a supervisor or a director that insists on them putting themselves in situations that they would perceive to be dangerous. And I think that that's important to acknowledge and to recognize, is that, you know, when we talk about self-care and we talk about trauma, it's so normalized in our field that we don't actually take a step back and say, this isn't normal. This is trauma. This is a serious mental health problem, and it requires a serious mental health solution. So yeah, that's part of our unique perspective. And then the last bullet point there, if you can pull it up, Trace, is we are an organization by advocates for advocates. We have been on the front lines. We have worked you know, in shelters and hospitals and you know, every aspect of the advocacy work, whether that's domestic violence or child protective services. We've been all over the place. So we know what it's like to be on the front lines, and we take that experience with us, and we use that to motivate us to support and care for the advocates that we serve.
So when we do these presentations, we like to have a land acknowledgement, of course. We have shared that land acknowledgement earlier in the beginning, and we of course acknowledge that we are on lands that do not belong to us. And again, like Kyle said, this presentation is much more geared towards survivor advocates. There's never been a time where I haven't worked, or I would say Kyle hasn't worked, or any of us hasn't worked with someone who is a survivor advocate. And again, do not believe that for a content warning that this will be anything more than light to medium, but we'd like you to absolutely make sure that you're taking care of you. No, we do our best always when we're presenting on self-care for advocates is preventing. We try to make sure we're doing practical suggestions. We want to make sure that there's educational content and that these are informed opinions. We want to make sure that we're bringing you the most current information that we can possibly gather, either from our own information that in our own surveys and our own anecdotes, and or from research that's going on currently. Please feel free to write down any questions in the chat. We have moderators, of course, who are with us. Thank you, Casey and Nikki and Anne, and everyone else, Tiara, everyone else for helping out and keeping an eye on those questions for us. But if you'd like to add them in the chat or if you'd like to put them in the Q&A, please feel free. Kyle?
Yep. So this is a statistic that we use fairly often. There was a study done back in 2007 that found that about 1 in 3 helping professionals struggle with their mental health. And specifically when it gets into diagnosable PTSD, it's about 1 in 6, which is twice the general population. So this is just some data that we use to really kind of drive home the fact that this is a pervasive problem. Tracy, you want to go to the next? Mm-hmm. And it brings us into this question of why are we talking about survivor advocates? So that 1 in 3 is everyone in the field, right? But when we start getting into the issue of survivor advocates, and when we did our own community needs assessment back in 2020, what we found was that 67% of the advocates who completed our survey had experienced some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And about 26% indicated they had experienced sexual assault since they began their advocacy career. So when you think about that, and we think about, 1 in 3 are struggling with their mental health as a result of vicarious trauma, and then we have about 2/3 that have experienced their own experience with direct trauma. It makes absolute sense why we would see survivor advocates having 2.5 to 3 times more likely to report severe levels of vicarious trauma and burnout. And when we compare this just to sexual assault advocates, it's about 1.8 times. So we know that sexual assault advocates in general do experience higher levels, but that is amplified when we have this intersection of being a survivor and being a sexual assault advocate. And just saying it exacerbates the problem. And the reason why is your brain can't actually tell the difference between a experience that has happened to you and an experience that you are imagining. And so what I mean by that is, and I come from a neuroscience perspective, your brain can tell to some extent that an experience that is not yours. But the more, for example, sleep deprived, or the more stressed you are, or the less grounded you are, the less likely you are to be able to consciously remind your brain this didn't happen to you. And so you begin to experience physiological and neurobiological effects as if it was happening to you. In fact, they've done studies, neuroimaging studies, where they've found that people who were sleep deprived, for example, when they see somebody in pain, the same parts of their brain light up in seeing the person in pain as if they were experiencing the pain themselves. So this is all to say, we're not just giving lip service when we're talking about the importance of taking care of yourself. There is a science to it. There's a evidence to support the fact that if you're not taking care of yourself, you are at an increased risk for developing something as severe as PTSD, whether or not you have your own personal experience with it or not. We know that having a high level of empathy increases the risk of vicarious trauma. And of course, survivor advocates have some of the highest highest levels of empathy for survivors. And we also know that sexual violence advocacy often relies on embodied language. So, for example, when we're talking to survivors and they are telling us about their experience, they often describe the issues that they are experiencing, whether the assault happened many years ago or recently. They experience their trauma as often physical or visceral sensations. And so when they're communicating that to us, because embodied language is so important to our survival as a species, our brains respond to that. And if I were to say your right hand, your brain is going to automatically think about your own right hand. And it's going to process that as if it's your own, right? So I say my right hand, you think right hand, and it pulls up that in your brain. So when we start digging into a traumatic situation and there's body-based language here, the likelihood that you're going to experience your own physical sensations or perceive things physically for yourself is much higher when we're talking about sexual assault advocacy than if we were talking about, say, disaster response. And it's the same thing with the type of content that we're dealing with. So sexual violence advocacy is often dealing with very old content. Sometimes survivors may not reach out for 10, 20 years. And so the problem becomes that we're oftentimes not able or we're not afforded the luxury of using the executive functions of our brain to plan, right? So if you're doing domestic violence advocacy or you're doing disaster response, oftentimes what you're doing is you're working with an immediate crisis situation and you're often dealing with an ongoing threat. So you're in a planning mode, you're using the parts of your brain that are responsible for thinking forward. Whereas when we are doing sexual assault advocacy or we're dealing with very old trauma material, even if it's not sexual assault, but for this presentation, if you're dealing with old trauma material, you're often relying on your own biographical memory to imagine that experience. And so if you're a survivor advocate, I can give you, two guesses as to what memories are you using in order to imagine the experiences of your client. You're probably using your own experience. And that comes from a place of empathy, but it is something that we as a field need to talk about as being hazardous. It's dangerous to do. And then the last point that we have here is the issue of the way that our movement talks about this. So, how many people, and you can put this in the chat, how many people have heard this idea that you have to come into this field having processed all your trauma? You have to be 100% ready to go, absolutely, no issues. You've processed it all because you can't be in a place where you're still struggling with it. How many people have heard that? I certainly have. And the thing is, we would never tell a survivor that there should be any point at which they are healed, right? Or at which they should no longer be triggered by something. And so why don't we extend that same grace and that same understanding of trauma-informed care to ourselves and to our colleagues?
So one of the takeaways that we're hoping for everyone to kind of be thinking about, and we know that we have leadership and we know that we have individuals who have positions of authority or influence in their organizations, is that our takeaway is that we cannot claim to support all survivors and ignore this massively underserved population that we're working alongside. See, again, like Kyle was saying, is that the likelihood is that you've heard, or you've had it somewhere in there where someone had said something like, well, they can't come, they can't work with us, they can't volunteer with us until they're in a better place in their healing. And the reality is that puts so often, if we have a victim advocate, we are a survivor advocate in the movement, and they experience some type of trauma, their domestic violence, sexual assault, car accident, any of these other traumas, anything, but they're having a difficult time dealing with it. And then we're having that conversation of, well, they must be in their trauma. They can't possibly do this work. We're not looking at any accommodations for them. And that is something as a movement we have to be considering also. So like we were saying, survivor advocates, we have this repeated trauma exposure. So we're looking at all of these different areas. So we have, a dysregulated system, and then we're dealing also with conditioned automatic responses. So we love that. We absolutely love our social ecological model. So if we're looking at that personal care, it's sometimes we have to think about taking a pause for our own benefit. So some may have heard of box breathing before. I am very grateful that Raft introduced this to me. It's something that I do often now, and it's been a huge benefit. It's great for those transition moments and those times where you're having, like, going from one point to the next and needing just to take a pause. I'm going to press play in just a second, but I want to encourage you just to maybe sit back in your chair and maybe just take a few moments to attempt to breathe to the point and following along with the video.
Trace, before you do that, I just want to kind of bring a point. One of the things that we talk about is in that conditioned response, every advocate has that phone ring, right? That phone ringtone that you associate with a crisis line. And even if you are not on call, right? You're just out and somebody happens to have that ringtone, it triggers that response. It triggers that flight or flight mode where you are back in that space and you're ready to do advocacy. That is a conditioned response, and that is an effect of repeated trauma exposure. Because what's happening when you're getting that phone call, right? You're about to be exposed to something traumatic, so your body responds in that way. So one of the reasons why we talk about box breathing and we're talking about this importance of transitions is this is a tool that you can use. And I see a bunch of people talking about you still have it 4 months later and you haven't been on call. I still have it. I have not been on call in 3 years. 4 years. There's still a ringtone that if I hear it, my heart starts Pavlovian response. Exactly. My heart starts pounding and I'm ready to go. That's just one example, right? And that's just the most obvious example because it is such a Psych 101 thing. But think about all of the different really triggers that you experience in your life that spill over into all of these other aspects of your life. There's so many things in trauma that, whether it's smells, sounds, and we were talking about this importance of bodied language and its effect on us. There's so many aspects of that are also endemic to our work. We don't give ourselves the space to think about that and to really use these tools like box breathing to address them.
Are we ready to try the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
This sounds not.
Sorry, y'all.
Okay. Let's also keep this organic a little bit. So feel free to use the Q&A. Somebody just brought up that supervisors and EDs don't seem to understand what the ringtone does. And I think for some, that's probably true. I think there's also a thing of, and this goes back to our double speak in the movement, right? We've normalized it. We've normalized this so much. We've said it's just a hazard of the job for so long. And, you know, when you think about people who have been in the field for a very long time, they've spent the past maybe 3 or 4 decades being told this is just what you signed up for.
Agree.
And you know, I think one of the things that it's a dicey thing, and I know we got a little heated yesterday during our panel when we were talking, but we also have to remember that some of the leaders in our movement have also been hurt by the movement too. And when they're repeating that trauma, it's because that's what they've learned, right? And it's going to take all of us doing our part to unlearn the things that we have normalized. You know, I do agree. There are some people in positions of power, though, that have never worked a crisis line, have no idea what that's like. And that is another part of the problem. But I do want us to be mindful of the fact that a big part of what we are trying to do at Self-Care for Advocates is denormalize the things that we've normalized about this work, right? Because our emotional, and this is going to get into something else that we're going to talk about later, but something that we always tell survivors is there's no such thing as a normal response to, or there's no such thing.
An abnormal response. All right. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So that
you know what I'm trying to say.
There is no, yeah, it's been a minute since I've said it, but it's so true of that. You're having a normal reaction to an abnormal circumstance.
Yes. And it is not normal for people to experience trauma every day, all day. You should not be experiencing trauma one phone call after the other. And really think about that. I've worked in agencies where it was not abnormal for an advocate to see thousands of clients a year. So you're talking oftentimes dozens of clients a day, phone call after phone call, court case after court case, you're running from one to the other. There is no moment to breathe, right? Now, I think even with a part of our culture was we just didn't even think to try to implement that. But, you know, that's important. It's important to acknowledge that this isn't a normal experience. People who don't work in the field don't understand. They would have no concept for how much we've normalized trauma. If you've ever been in a therapist's office, or if you've ever had a therapist, worked as a therapist, where a client starts to say something that they've just like don't even think about as being traumatic, and then they make that, and then the therapist makes that face like, that's what we've done. That's what we've done. We've started we've normalized so many of our traumas in this field. We don't even recognize them anymore, and we don't even recognize the harm that they're doing to us. And this is amplified, of course, when we're talking about survivor advocates, right? Because not only are they being forced to normalize the trauma that this work is impressing upon them, but they're also in some ways normalizing the trauma that they've experienced themselves in their personal life. So Tracy, you want to talk about negative appraisals and shame?
Well, I think we can, when we're in the midst of so much of this work, that we have those moments where we are our very best bullies when it comes to, you know, always picking apart everything that we did, and everything that we've said and everything that we could have said. I don't know if anyone else has ever had the moment where you're walking away from a situation and you think of like 10 better things you could have said, or how could I have handled that better, or just really picking that apart and Monday morning quarterbacking yourself. And we end up doing that quite often when we're in that moment and we're working as frontline advocates. And then we also end up having so much inappropriate guilt and shame. That is another area of why we want to open this up and to do more to shine a light on this. And I know that we'll have a presentation tomorrow that definitely will. But I know there's been moments as someone who is in a position of leadership, walking away from a situation, knowing that I might not have been able to handle it as well as I wanted to, and then feeling a lot of guilt about our agency not being able to take care of someone well enough, and then or feeling shame about a situation because that wasn't something that I felt like I had handled well enough because of either not having enough training or not having enough reserve myself for the energy that it was going to take with that other advocate. And so it ends up being a complex knot. But again, we're having normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. And we have to do what we can to allow ourselves to have some grace and allow ourselves to have some self-compassion at the core of this. I want to take a look at this next, the ABC method. Now, Kyle, can you speak briefly about this?
Yeah, so the ABC method is something you may have seen if you have a background in counseling or mental health. It comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is that our emotions and our behaviors and our responses to things are actually a result of the beliefs that we have about things or the circumstances, the events that happen. So, for example, an activating event might be you go to a hospital for a sexual assault exam with a survivor. And that survivor has a bad experience and they end up not following up with services. Now, your beliefs about that might be that it was your fault, right? You might walk away from that hospital call thinking, this is my fault, I could have done more, and the survivor isn't getting services because I didn't do enough. And then the consequences of that are going to be your emotional responses. So you might feel shame, you might feel frustration, you might feel depressed. Those are all, that's a very linear thought process, and it almost happens automatically for us. And so the ABC method is really about keeping track of that thought process and then interrogating those beliefs. So this idea that I should have been able to make that experience better for the survivor, I'm the reason they didn't get help. Is that true? Right? Is it really true that you didn't do enough, or was it because of circumstances that were actually beyond your control? And do you even know if that was how the survivor perceived it? Maybe you saw things that they didn't. We tend to know how a SANE exam should go. And if it doesn't go exactly how we know it's supposed to go, we look at that and we might freak out. But somebody who's never seen one or doesn't know how it's supposed to go may not necessarily know that something happened that shouldn't have happened, and they may not be having that reaction to it that you think. But the big thing is that is it true that it's really your fault that this person didn't follow up for services? And if you think about that, probably that's not the case. I have a hard time believing that any advocate where this is their thought process didn't do enough. If you're questioning yourself, you absolutely did. And then the follow-up question is any of that helpful? You know, is feeling ashamed, is feeling frustrated, is feeling guilty helpful? And it makes me think of Dr. Gantz's presentation, which he ended on with this idea of seeing things the way that they are and seeing things the way that they should be. And it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to feel your feelings about injustices. But at some point, we also have to be hopeful that things can be better. And if you're stuck in this, it's my fault, I feel ashamed, I feel guilty, I'm frustrated, that's not helping you move forward, and that's not helping that survivor. It's not helping any other survivor. So this is just one method that you can use to kind of slow down your thoughts and challenge them when they come up like this.
So again, if we're building on this big picture and we're using that social ecological theory, you know, we're also seeing sometimes that when we're survivor advocates or we are working with survivor advocates, we may see that there's a reluctance to set firm boundaries. And that can be a huge challenge. And one thing that I encourage us to consider is looking at more tools for boundary setting. Now, looking at more specifics. And I don't know about you, and I'm glad we'll be talking about this again tomorrow, but boundary setting can be very challenging, and it can be something that doesn't necessarily always feel fantastic. But if we practice it, and if we look at some different steps, that can be really helpful for when we end up in that situation, either as the advocate in the middle of the process, or the director or the supervisor trying to help someone walk through it. So we suggest clearly stating the boundary, letting someone know what that could be. And there could be lots of different areas with that. Ashley, who works with us, talks a lot about, she calls Brene Brown Pastor Brene, and she's, you know, and Brene Brown's work often reflects back on that clear is kind. So if we can clearly state what the boundary is, you know, maybe that boundary is like what Dr. Gantz was talking about, realizing that the staff there can't have emails going out 24/7. That's just not an effective way for people to get rest. And then looking at the next area of that is defining limits, then looking at what the natural consequences are for those violations. But one thing that I want to touch in here is to not apologize. We, at our house, my son apologizes for everything all the time, to the point where we had to get a I'm sorry jar, because we had to explain to him that every single time he says he's sorry, it's not that, it's a reflex, and he doesn't have to apologize for every little thing. And I think sometimes we do that ourselves. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't, you know, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, oh, I'm sorry to bother you, I'm sorry. You know, if we step that back, that can be really important. Try changing some of that language on its head. You know, I'm sorry, so we can stop doing these shame spirals so often and moving towards this idea of not apologizing and not explaining. And then following through. I love that when we were putting this presentation together, that we put predictability is being trauma informed. So people know what to expect from you, and they know what's to expect from a situation that's clear and that's kinder. So let's also look at organizational care, because that's that next level after we move past personal. Oops. So if we're looking at trauma organized institutions, I would be willing to argue, as a person who has never worked at an organization that did not have significant trauma organization, that most advocates have experienced this at some point, where they are walking into an organization that has had some type of significant trauma, either job loss, death of other advocates, some type of violence, something that has happened within that organization. But these types of organizations, we're looking at a lack of trauma-informed supervision and leadership. We're really good in our movement as a whole of saying, oh, we're trauma-informed. But I question that. I question if we actually are trauma-informed, because if we're causing this much harm to advocates as a whole, then I'm not sure that we understand what trauma-informed actually means. So we stand very strongly with the concept of trauma-informed supervision. Trauma-informed supervision is the next level of just supervision, and certainly we also really try our best to look at vicarious trauma-informed supervision. But these 5 principles of trauma-informed supervision starts with safety. Are we making sure that the advocate that we're supervising feels safe? And are they able to have a clear communication with the supervisor? Are they able to have an understanding of boundaries for both individuals, the supervisee and the supervisor? Do they understand that? Is someone going to be able to have a chance to respectfully disagree? Advocates are passionate folks, as evidenced by yesterday's panel. We get very passionate about things, but is it safe for us to communicate that? Like I was saying, I think yesterday, having a supervisor who, when you're in the midst of the staff meeting and their, orders are being barked and your job is feeling like it may be being threatened, but then being asked at the last minute, but everybody still loves their job, right? Doesn't feel safe. So we have to step away from making people feel that way and look at ways we can make them feel safe. Transparency and communication also. We have to be more transparent with what our expectations are and how we communicate. It goes a long way sometimes when someone says, hey, I'm just having a rough time. Or as a supervisor, I would say, listen, I'm sorry, I'm going to close my door for a while because I need to have a little bit of a break. I also started looking at other ways as a supervisor. And one, I had a survivor advocate who I worked with, who often would come in and would just kind of erupt while we were talking. And I ended up spending a lot of time working with this person and had to have a lot of time out of my day. So I ended up having that moment in the communication where when they came into my office, I would say, listen, I have this amount of time in which I can talk. I have 5 minutes, I have 10 minutes, or I would say, I have this amount of energy. So that would be, and that would set up the boundary for both of us. Peer support is really critical too, and certainly collaboration and empowerment. We have to give advocates the space to not be okay. We have to give people a chance not to feel judged for not being okay. And we have to give people the choice to heal. We can't just let survivor advocates, feel like they have to twist in the wind or not be able to feel strong or steady, or that they won't be safe with us, or to be able to say, hey, something bad has just happened to me, or I feel really not in a good place right today. I don't think I can go to the hospital, or I don't think I can run the support group. Is there something else I can do today? If we're looking at our work as more of a collective, then that offers more opportunities for that. Kyle, do you want to talk about this next part?
Yeah, so one of the things that that we often see is that organizations that often work with trauma survivors become organized around that trauma. And when one part of the organization is impacted by trauma, whether that's an individual or a specific department, it could be the result of a somebody being let go because of burnout or vicarious trauma. It could be somebody that experienced a trauma in their personal life. When one part of the organization's trauma, it infects the entire organization. And when we normalize the trauma that we've experienced in our organization, we start to engage in behaviors that are not trauma informed. So it tends to be, of course, not responding in a trauma informed way. It can be exploitive working conditions like lack of living wages. We've talked about that a lot during this conference because it's significant. It is very disempowering to, and it's ironic, and this is part of that double speak in our movement. It's ironic that we are a movement built on empowerment. We talk about it all the time, but we have some of the most disempowering policies and practices within our organizations. We don't give people the opportunity to use these tools, right? It's not enough to tell your staff that they need to take breaks. It's not enough to tell your staff that when you leave the office, don't do work. That's great. That's great if you're a supervisor and you're saying, don't do any work once you leave the office. But if you're texting and emailing your staff when they leave the office, you're not actually giving them the opportunity to follow that boundary or to enforce that boundary. So there's so much of this conversation around self-care that happens within organizations that's really just an excuse for organizations to continue doing things that are harmful, and to shift the blame onto the advocates that are doing the work, right? It's victim blaming 101. You're not taking care of yourself, when in actuality, the organization isn't taking care of you. And it doesn't matter how much self-care you do, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, you cannot use cognitive behavioral therapy or mindful breathing or any of these tools to work your way out of institutional oppression. If the system is working against you and we're not doing anything about that, there's no amount of self-care that's going to fix that. We have to be doing both, right? And the opposite can be true too, right? You can also have an organization that gives everybody an opportunity to do self-care, gives them all the resources possible, and you still have people that aren't doing it. So it's a both and situation. But I do want to tie this back into what this initial presentation was about, was survivor advocates. And I want to draw attention back to one of the first statistics we talked about, that about 26% of the advocates that we surveyed had experienced their first instance of sexual assault or domestic violence since beginning their career. So think about that. Think about how, and this ties directly into our issue with community care, but think about how absolutely isolating that has to be a survivor, and you're also the service provider, and all of your colleagues are the service providers. Where do you go for help? what are organizations in our movement doing for survivor advocates who become survivors or experience an instance of sexual violence or domestic violence while working in the field. I can speak anecdotally from having worked in this field. I know that of several colleagues I've had over the years who have just at one point or another, whether they were volunteers or staff members, who had disclosed that they were in an unhealthy or unsafe relationship, or that something had happened to them.
Yes. Yes.
They didn't bring it to the attention of supervisors or directors. And I understood why. I knew exactly why they didn't, because they didn't want to be perceived as being weak. They felt a whole bunch of shame around this idea of, I'm the prevention educator. I'm the person that's supposed to know, to see the red flags. I'm the person that's supposed to be able to stop this, and I couldn't stop it from happening to myself. There is no amount of expertise you will ever be able to have that makes you completely immune from this issue. And that's important for us to integrate both into our practice when we are doing community education, and it's important for us to integrate into our policies as organizations. Because the reality is, right, anybody can find themselves in that situation. And particularly when we have organizations that are disempowering people, that are normalizing and desensitizing them to trauma, and are gaslighting advocates, because that's what we do, right? We put it back on advocates. This is your fault, that you're not taking care of yourself. When we do all of these things, it makes absolute sense why we would see this, right? We're not doing, we talk about in prevention all the time, the importance of, addressing the social aspects of violence, right? Making sure that people have access, making sure that people are empowered. How many programs are out there that are specifically targeted to increasing the financial capacity of girls and young women, right? So that they're not finding themselves in abusive situations. There's so many. There are entire aspects of the World Health Organization devoted to that, right? But then our own organizations financially and physically disempower people. So this, Trace, do you want to talk a little bit more about this, or?
Well, actually, I 100% do, but I also want to be very respectful of people's time. And we're right at 3:30, which is when we said we take another break. So if you want to take a chance or take a moment and take a look, if you haven't done so already, help us continue this conversation. Join the Facebook group, send us an email. Let us know what you are doing to support survivor advocates in your organizations. We would love to put together some resources and lists, and so survivor advocates have more tools at their fingertips. So let us know, please. We'd be very, very grateful. Now, I'm gonna just leave this up for just another second so you can just grab those if you need them. But I just really appreciate everyone. We've been getting messages saying that you've shared some really important things, and we appreciate that too.